Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to everyone, all of you present here in this auditorium, and all those who are participating virtually. I'm Brother Daryl Moresco, the Managing Director of the Center for Carmelite Studies. Let us begin with prayer. And we'll begin with a slight reflection, a short reflection, and conclude with the prayer. This is from the Act of Oblation to Merciful Love of St Thérèse of Lisieux. After earth's exile, I hope to go and enjoy you in the fatherland. But I do not want to lay up merits for heaven. I want to work for your love alone. In the evening of this life, I shall appear before you with empty hands, for I do not ask you, Lord, to count my works. All our justice is stained in your eyes. I wish then to be clothed in your own justice and to receive from your love the eternal possession of yourself. I want no other throne, no other crown, but you, my beloved. Time is nothing in your eyes, and a single day is like 1,000 years. You can then, in one instant, prepare me to appear before you. In order to live in one single act of perfect love, I offer myself to your merciful love. I want, O my beloved, at each beat of my heart, to renew this offering to you an infinite number of times, until the shadows having disappeared, I may be able to tell you of my love in an eternal face to face. And let us pray. O God of merciful love, you have promised your kingdom to those who are willing to become like little children. Help us to follow the little way of St Thérèse with confidence and love, so that we may come to know your eternal glory. Grant this through Christ our Lord. Amen. And now I'd like to welcome Father Stephen Payne, who is the Chair of Carmelite Studies, to introduce the President of Catholic University.
Yes, and I also add my thanks to all of you for coming, and all of you who are watching online. We're grateful for your participation, and we're very honored to have with us this afternoon Dr. Peter Kilpatrick, who's the president of Catholic University of America. And he's often mentioned that he's a big fan of St. Thérèse as well. So we're really pleased that he was able to be here with us. The Center for Carmelite Studies is part of the Catholic University of America. And we thank you for coming to welcome our guests.
Thank you, Pastor Steve. Your Eminence, Cardinal Arborelius, Your Excellency Bishop Johannesson, Father Steve, faculty, friends, attendees, I'm very pleased to be invited to share just a few short remarks on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Little Flower's beatification, the 150th anniversary of her birth, and the 200th anniversary just a few days ago of the birth of her father, Saint Louis Martin. The Little Flower, Saint Thérèse, Thérèse of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face, the patron saint of aviators, flowers, the missions, and for us Catholics, the patron saint of Russia, and as of 1997, the 33rd Doctor of the Church, is certainly one of the most popular saints in the history of the Church. I have a great devotion to St. Thérèse, and I've learned much of her spirituality through two sources. The first source are the writings of Jean-Pierre de Caussade, the Jesuit spiritual director of nuns in Nancy, France in the early 18th century, and the author of Abandonment to Divine Providence. And you might ask, how could you have learned about St. Thérèse from Jean-Pierre de Caussade? But I'm certain that Louis Martin and his family had the writings of Jean-Pierre de Caussade and the Abandonment and the Prayer of the Quiet in their home in Lisieux. And Thérèse must have fed on this spirituality. And if she didn't, she absorbed it in some other way, because it's almost certain that there's a direct descendants of the Prayer of Quiet and the abandonment to the love of God in the writings of Jean-Pierre and Thérèse. The second source has been through the writings of Father Jacques Philippe, a priest of the Beatitudes and a popular spiritual writer of the last 40 years, who has written extensively of St. Thérèse's little elevator to God. The essence of her spirituality appears to me to be closely linked to being spiritually poor, allowing the torrent of God's love to flow over us, as Father Marie Eugène of the Child Jesus writes, and always running to our Father, who loves us, and to claim his tender mercy. I think it is fair to say that Thérèse's spirituality has transformed the spiritual lives of 5 or 6 generations of Christians this past century and a quarter. I'm very grateful to Father Steve, the chair of Carmelite Studies, and the Center for Carmelite Studies for hosting this very important ecumenical discussion. I'm also very grateful to His Eminence, Anders Cardinal Arborelius, and Her Excellency Bishop Karin Johannesson for actively participating in this discussion and for nobly advancing the cause of unity among our Lutheran and Catholic sisters and brothers, an effort which I believe is very important here in the 21st century. I would also like to greet a number of important invited guests today. The Executive Director of the Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs for the Conference of Catholic Bishops, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Father Walter Kajerski. A number of members of the USCCB Lutheran Catholic Dialogue, including Bishop Dennis Madden of Baltimore, who's joined us. He's the chair of the National Catholic Lutheran Dialogue. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America Interreligious Relations leaders, Reverend Dr. Carmelo Santos and Catherine Lohr. Thank you. And the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C., Bishop Marianne Edgar Booty. We're very blessed to have such a gathering today for such an important discussion. And I want to beg your forgiveness for having to depart early today. We're also installing the rector of our seminary this afternoon, Father Bud Stevens, over at Theological College. So I'm only here for a few short minutes, but I'm very grateful to all of you for coming and participating in this important discussion. So I will pray for fruitful dialogue and for the success of your discussions. Thank you.
I'll just say a word about the format. We're going to invite Cardinal Arborelius and Bishop Johannesson up here to sit with their microphones, and they have a kind of a dialogue back and forth. And then at the end of that, I'll moderate the questions and answers. Okay, so you'll see me again at that point. And if there's any emergency or anything, but Cardinal and Bishop, if you would come up here, we could begin. We check to make sure the microphones are working. And you may know the occasion for this was the publication in English very recently of Bishop Johannesson's book, Thérèse and Martin, which is a kind of appreciation of Carmelite spirituality and Thérèse herself from a Lutheran perspective. And Cardinal Arborelius wrote the foreword to that. So they've already been involved in this dialogue, and we're glad that they're continuing it with us today. So welcome.
Thank you very much. This is a sound check, so...
Yes, we are on the line.
Yes, we are on the line. Well, it's a great honor and a great joy and an exciting experience to be here today for us, to get to know our common friend, St Thérèse of Lisieux, a bit better. I have been here in Washington, D.C. twice before as a visitor to Whitefriars Hall, and I have been visiting the Carmelite library there. And I think that some of the people that I have met then, they have wondered what I am doing there. You know, a Lutheran from Sweden, and now also a bishop in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Sweden. Why am I so interested in the Carmelite spirituality? I sometimes get that question, and then I used to think about St Thérèse of Lisieux and something that she tells us from her childhood. In her autobiography, she speaks about a teacher that asked her what she was doing in her free time, in her free afternoons. And she answered that she used to think. She replied that she went behind her bed in an empty space, closed herself in with her bed curtain, and thought. And the teacher asked her what she was thinking about, and Thérèse replied that she was thinking about God, about life, about eternity. In short, she was thinking. And later in life she writes, "I understand now that I was making mental prayer without knowing it, and that God was already instructing me in secret." I have had the opportunity to think a lot in my life. As a child, I grew up in Filipstad, a small Swedish town, and then later on as a philosopher of religion in Uppsala at the university. So I think this is something I have in common with Thérèse. We like to think. And when I had free time from school, my family sometimes went to the capital in the county where I come from. Karlstad is the capital. And in that town then, we had a bookstore. And it had been set up once by Dominican sisters. But when I grew up, this bookstore was run by a Christian publishing house. And the manager, he was a pastor in one of the free churches in Sweden. And he must have been very fond of Carmelite books, because there were separate shelves with Carmelite books, and they were very well stocked. And when I got into the bookstore, he sometimes asked me if there was anything in particular that I wanted to read, and he would sometimes also recommend books. And those books would be by a Carmelite friar, Wilfrid Stinnesen. And he was born in Belgium, and he came to Sweden as a friar, and he died in Sweden in 2013. And when I was in my late I was nearly 20 years old. I think I was still a teenager, but he recommended one of those books to me and said, "I think you would enjoy this book." And I did enjoy this book. It was a book that encouraged my thinking. So next time I got to the bookstore, he said, "Did you like the last book by the Carmelite friar? Perhaps you could enjoy this one also." So I read another book, and I used to go to the shelves with the Carmelite books when I went to Karlstad. And sometimes I would look at the books. The covers of the books by Wilfrid Stinnesen, they were very colorful. So you said, this I can read. But the books about Thérèse of Lisieux and the books written by the Cardinal, they were having black and white covers. And I thought that, well, this might be too heavy for me, but someday in the future I might read also those books. Maybe they can also make me think sometime in the future. So it was by books that I met the Carmelite tradition. And when I grew up, I didn't meet any Catholics nearly at all, because I grew up in Filipstad and there were, well, all were Lutherans or belonging to the free churches. But I met the Catholic faith and the Carmelites, and I didn't experience what I was reading as something that was part of another tradition. I thought, well, this is very Lutheran to me, so it encouraged my thinking. And one question that I would like to ask the Cardinal is, do you think that I'm a normal Swede?
No, luckily, I would say, because a normal Swede would never go to church, never open a Bible. He would be a very, very secular person. But things are happening even in our society. And I usually say it's a more post-secular society. People are getting more interested in spirituality of all kinds. And of course, we have a rich tradition of publishing spiritual books in Sweden. Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant. And I think there are more people reading spiritual books than going to church. So that's our challenge, to help them to find the way to the church. A little background of the religious geography of Sweden is necessary. Sweden used to be a totally Lutheran country. When I was young, more than 90% were Lutheran. Now it's still above 50. Catholics, about 1 or maybe 2%, and mostly immigrants. So I often get the question, are you a real Swede? And I say, perhaps not totally, but I was born in Sweden and I have lived nearly my entire life in Sweden. I became a Catholic at the age of 20. I was baptized in the Lutheran Church, but I'm afraid I was a very bad Lutheran. I hardly ever went to church, but I had a longing for God. And I think that's so important, even in a secular society, that there are always people longing for God, even if they don't know Him. And that's so hopeful to see that we can help people to find the way to God. And I think the Carmelite way is a very important way. Also in our post-secular, and if we say post-Lutheran society. And I'm always impressed that there are so many Lutherans who have discovered Catholic spirituality. You are not the only one. Many love the spiritual exercises of St Thérèse of Loyola. They have even introduced it into the prisons. We have Swedish Lutheran Benedictine brothers. We have a bishop who is member of Focolare. We have a society called Societas Sancta Birgitta, a Lutheran society in honor of St. Bridget. So there is a good number of good Lutherans who also have discovered Catholic spirituality. So that has been very important for the Ecumenical Dialogue. We often speak about spiritual ecumenism. It's easier to come closer if we join in spiritual life, in prayer, and then we can approach the dogmatical differences with more humility and more openness. So that has proved a very efficient way. I can take another example from the Pentecostal Church. We have a very famous preacher called Peter Halldorf, who has discovered the Coptic tradition and the old fathers of the church. And we have a dialogue with the Pentecostals. And we wanted to take the most difficult theme, Mary, because in the classical Pentecostal tradition, Mary is very, very far away. But we discovered that gradually there was an opening. So that's what we see in Sweden, that this spiritual ecumenism has meant a lot in order to come closer. So I think your discovery of Therese has been a very important thing for the ecumenical situation in Sweden. But how can we work further?
Yes, that's a very good question. I sometimes also get the question where we met for the first time. So I would like to tell you something about that, because we met at the retreat center. And that is also part of the background in Sweden, that we have this retreat center called Berget, the mountain. And the cardinal, he still preaches a yearly retreat at that center. Mm. And I think it was St. John of the Cross that brought me to this retreat center and to a retreat that the cardinal was preaching, because it was his books that I started to read at first when I began reading the Carmelites. I thought it was very fascinating and interesting and intriguing to reading about the dark night of the soul. Mm-hmm. And I think that is also something that we could discuss and contemplate and think about when we bring ecumenism, the spiritual ecumenism, further. Mm. Because there is a lot of mental illness in our society, and a lot of people experience different kinds of dark nights. Mm-hmm. And how can faith grow during such periods? That is a theme I would like us to talk more about. Mm. And in the book I do engage Martin Luther and St. John of the Cross in a dialogue about faith and about the dark night of the soul. And another theme that I think that we could explore with the help of the Carmelites is how Christ, what it means to belong to Christ in today's world. And in the book, I let Martin Luther and St Thérèse of Avila discuss that theme. And I have a very special relationship with St Thérèse of Avila. I'm a philosopher of religion, and when I first met her through the textbooks, because she's she's the greatest mystic in the Christian tradition. So as a philosopher of religion, you have to read about her. And I did, and she appeared to me to be quite mad at first, I would say. I couldn't understand her at all. She seemed to just have a lot of religious experiences and never thinking about it at all. So I wasn't that fond of her. I was very fond of St. John of the Cross. But then I went to the retreat center, and the cardinal preached a retreat on St. Thérèse of Avila. And he told us to begin by reading her letters and then get to know her. And I did, and I was so fascinated by this woman. She was so funny, she was so clever, she was like very motivated and inspiring, and a lot of things that I want to see in church leaders today. So she became something of I would like to learn more from her. But when I started to read her writings in an abbreviated form, I realized that the textbooks in philosophy of religion, they are heavily edited. So sometimes they edit her texts so that her real argument is no longer there. And that made me a bit furious, because you wouldn't do that to Martin Luther without someone complaining, saying this is not the case, this is not what he was thinking about. So I changed my opinion on Thérèse of Avila, and so it was also when I first began reading Thérèse of Lisieux. I found her a bit hard to be inspired by, in fact, because I thought she wrote too much about flowers. It was a lot of flowers in her books. But I went to a retreat and realized that I should probably read her last conversations first, and then read her autobiography in light of her last conversations. And when I did that, I began to realize that I could really recognize my own story and my own theology and my own spirituality as a Lutheran in her writings. So I started to write, compare Luther in the margins. And especially one expression caught my attention, and it is when in one conversation it took place in June 1897, Therese spoke about everything is a grace. Everything is a grace. And this insight is fundamental in Therese's life, and it is also fundamental in the theology of Martin Luther. Luther continuously writes and preaches about grace alone. So when I began to notice such similarities, I thought that this might be something that I want to do more of. This might be a way to move the ecumenical dialogue a bit further if we begin by contemplating grace with Martin, Luther, and Thérèse of Lisieux. So that would be one way of bringing the ecumenical dialogue a bit further.
Yes, we are very grateful that you have reminded us of the dogmatic importance of the little flower, because I think it's very important to realize that dogma becomes more alive thanks to our saints and our mystics. And that's also important for the ecumenical dialogue, that we really stress the importance of spiritual theology. And unfortunately, in our Nordic countries, at the universities, that is not taught. It's regarded as devotional. So here you are a revolutionary. If you as a Lutheran bishop can put on the table the importance of spiritual theology. And I have the experience that if we start with those saints and other mystical and other person who have really lived their faith, it's easier to approach also the dogmatical questions that are difficult for us to find the same opinion. So I think that spiritual theology, the message of the saints, can be ever so important in order to promote a deeper ecumenical dialogue. Because we know that we have to prepare ourselves on various levels for a deeper dialogue. We need a human friendship. We need a spirit of tolerance and respect. Then we can start, and then we continue, I think, also in prayer. We have to walk on our knees in order to come closer as Christians. And that's why we need the message of the saints, not only the Carmelites. You are very much in favor of the Carmelites, so for me as a Carmelite it's very hopeful. But we must not forget the other saints and the other mystics. And St Ignatius can also help us. I always think about this theological conflict between Dominicans and Jesuits around grace. It was such a heavy conflict that the Pope prohibited the discussion about grace. But now we can start it again, thanks to the little flower. So that's one point. Then the mystery of salvation, St. John of the Cross, the Incarnation, Teresa of Avila, the Trinity, Elizabeth of the Trinity, and so forth. So we have much to do, I would say, if we shall find a deeper way of living in dialogue. I think it's also important to stress it's not only discussion, it's in a secular society. As Christians, we are all a bit unnormal. So we have to find a way of living more together, speaking about the faith at our meetings and living it together. And then we can go further in the more dogmatical questions. Are you of the same opinion?
Yes, I am. And I think within ecumenism, we are used to talking about faith and order movement and about life and works movement. But I think we also need a prayer and holiness movement within ecumenism. And not at least today, when we see the climate crisis and the injustices in the world. I think Therese can she can encourage us by well, she had a principle to not, well, always the least. That is part of something that's in her writings. To not live with more resources than we have, so to say, but to learn how to live a good life with little things, to be happy about the little things, so that we don't use up every resource that the earth has. So I think that's also something she can teach us, and that is important.
It is, and it's monastic wisdom, holy poverty in the spirit. And that can get a new touch in the situation of today, when we see that the planet is in danger of being destroyed. So somehow we have to work together with people of goodwill of all religions and all. And that could be important to have this accent of the saints who lived a life of poverty, a life in close relationship with Jesus Christ. And I think that Therese can be so important to open up the hearts of people for a deeper relationship to Jesus. And that's why she's so ecumenical, that everyone who is a Christian can recognize something of her longing to serve Jesus, to follow him, and to give her life for him. So that's a very, very important thing to transmit to people today. If they want to remain Christians, they have to grow into a more profound personal relationship with Christ. And there we need persons like Therese.
Yes, and as you said, I'm very fond of the Carmelites, you know. So in the book, I engage, say, an ecumenical panel discussion, but 3 different ecumenical dialogues, I would say. So in one chapter, I let Martin Luther and Thérèse of Lisieux discuss grace. And in the next chapter, it's Thérèse of Avila and Martin Luther, and they can discuss Christ and Christ alone. And then faith, that's the theme for the dialogue between John of the Cross and Martin Luther. We don't know what would have happened if they would have been on the scene today in an ecumenical panel discussion. Perhaps they would have had 2 different personalities in order to understand that they actually agree on more than they think or thought. But what we can do is to invite Lutherans and Catholics, Carmelites, Christians from all traditions in ecumenical dialogues on the questions that we struggle with today. And that is, I would say, receptive ecumenism, learning from different traditions. And that's very important for all humankind today and for the church. Well, in the book, I asked the question, what can we Lutherans learn from the Carmelites? And I hope that someone will pick up where I leave off. So what can the Carmelites or the Catholic Church learn from the Lutherans? That's a question that I can't answer as a Lutheran, not at least if I'm doing receptive ecumenism, because then you search for the answers that you have, the questions that you have in your own tradition. You try to find the answer with the help of other traditions. But that's one thing that I'm very curious about. What could the Carmelites or or the Catholic Church learn from the Lutherans? That's not the book we're discussing today, but perhaps the Cardinal has thought about that.
Well, I have to recognize that I'm not so familiar with Luther. As a Catholic in a minority, we were a bit afraid of Luther. We didn't want to come too close to him. But still, I think there are some very, very important things that we can really accept of Luther. That's his longing for truth, his longing to find a merciful God. He said, how can I find a merciful God? And Therese would have said, we already have a merciful God. But I think the seriousness of his longing and his strivings, that's very important for us as Catholic, because sometimes we have the tendency to think too easily that we know everything, that we, and he speaks about the daily conversion. And I think that's also very important for us as Carmelites. We could be a bit imperialistic. We have everything. We have doctors of the church. We have so much that we become a bit too proud of our heritage. But we have to realize that we are all poor sinners who need to convert even more. So I think this theme of constant conversion to Jesus and his cross is something that we could really learn from Luther. And a bit astonishingly, Luther wrote a commentary on Magnificat. And I think that's one of, I have to be very honest, you know, that's one of the few things I have read from Luther. But I think that could be very good for us to read, that Luther made a commentary on the Magnificat. And according to some scholars, he also accepted the Immaculate Conception and Mary as Semper Virgo. We have to ask the scholars if that is all right, because we know the Luther often changed his mind. But I think that there was a sincere veneration of the Virgin Mary in Luther's life. So those are the two things that I could point to, even if I'm not an expert in Luther, as you are an expert in Carmelite matters. We have to find a Catholic expert in Luther.
Yeah.
They do exist.
Yeah, they do. I met some of them, so I know. Sometimes the Lutherans ask me if the Carmelites take offense when I read the Carmelites and try to interpret their writings. And I used to ask that. I haven't met that reaction at all. So the Carmelites have been very friendly, trying to help me to find books to read and so on. And I hope that if some Carmelite or Catholic want to do the same thing with Luther, I hope that we Lutherans can be as friendly and nice, and not say that, oh, you haven't read all the books, you know, or you read them in the wrong way. You should probably understand them this way, because sometimes we can be that way when people try to understand their own heroes. So we have to have a principle of generosity, as we say in philosophy of religion or philosophy at all. We have to let people read the books together, and that is something I would encourage. Catholics, Lutherans, Christians from different denominations, traditions, reading the same books and speaking about their faith, what they find in common. So that would be encouraging.
Yes. I have to say something even more beautiful about you. Because the Lutheran Church in Sweden is not called the Lutheran Church. It's called Church of Sweden. And inside the Lutheran Church of Sweden, there are many who are not so interested in Luther. But I think you have brought about a kind of revival in the interest of Luther, at the same time as a kind of revival of Carmelites in your own church. So that's also a very important thing to realize, that Luther is somewhat forgotten, also among members of the Church of Sweden. And for a deeper ecumenical dialogue, we have to find our roots. So if we want to come closer, we have to return to the roots. And that's also an important accent of this book, that you have helped many of your own people in the Church of Sweden to discover Luther. I wouldn't be surprised if there were more people in the Church of Sweden who read Wilfrid Stinesen than Luther.
Well, I have to admit that it might be true, at least in some cases, because we had this exam before the ordination of the priests or pastors in the Church of Sweden in June, and we were discussing a text by Luther that they hadn't read before, and I thought that they should have read that before, so I was quite surprised. But I didn't ask if they have read Wilfrid Stinesen. I should do that next time. Yeah. Well, I think we are a bit curious if there are any questions and so.
We hope so.
We hope so.
We don't know if we can answer them, but we will try.
Oh, just a second. Yes. Does Brother Darrell have a microphone that he can take around? Or? Okay. 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 Yeah. So why don't we take 2 or 3 questions at a time and then give them a chance to answer those, and then we'll go on to the others. That tends to be a little more efficient, I think, and the time is limited. So go ahead. The first question is?
The question is, what we're talking about is actually truth. Moses really came out with that truth, the 10 Commandments, which is encapsulated in love of God and neighbor. You know, everything Jesus said was spiritual. We have a tendency to look at it materially. But all the churches, anyone who wants to love God has to accept the truth. So the truth is in the 10 Commandments. And so my question is that, first of all, in spirituality, Jesus is talking about every present moment. So we're talking about grace, which is in every present moment. So we're talking about being in love with God, Papa God. You know, the funny thing is, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph always pointed toward the Father. Jesus said, love God. In other words, love himself. But he said, love God the Father. So that's in the 10 Commandments. Somehow or other, down the line, we forgot. My question is, my question is, how can we reject one world order? That's my question.
The one world. Okay. Let's ask 1 or 2 other questions also, and then we'll give them a chance to respond. And let's keep the questions fairly brief too, or if you have a brief comment, so that more people get a chance to speak. Is there a second question? Yes, Father. Yeah. And then we'll let them answer those 2 questions. Yeah.
I think for many Catholics, Luther isn't thought of as being a warm figure. And so is there a warm figure of Lutheran writing and of the Lutheran tradition, also in kind of the school of spirituality, who you would direct us toward?
Okay, maybe we'll try those 2 questions first. One about the one world order, and about a good figure for us as Catholics to appreciate in Lutheranism.
I would recommend everyone to read On the Freedom of a Christian, because that is a very beautiful book, and it also presents Luther in the beginning as he presents himself as a mystic, I would say, a warm mystic. The faith unites us with Christ, just like the bride and the bridegroom is united. So I find that book very warm. And I also, because I recognize this picture of Luther, and I think that sometimes we Lutherans, we have been speaking about Luther as if everything was about dogmatics or theology. But if you read his letters, for example, and I could recommend, there's a doctoral dissertation about an Australian scholar about Luther's letters to people suffering from depression, and how we can use those letters today. And that is a book. Stephen Peach is the name of the author, and that's a book that I think presents Luther as a preacher and as a spiritual director for us today. So sometimes we Lutherans tend to read books and present Luther as he had that opinion and that opinion and that opinion. But we have to present Luther more as a caretaker of souls, I would say. But it's the same. I mean, in Sweden, we used to struggle with the picture that Luther is very severe and he's like telling you that you should do that and you should not do that. And we say that we have Luther on our shoulder, just telling you to do more and do more. And then we have to remind ourselves about that everything is a grace, you know. We should do nothing for God, but God does everything for us and in us. So it's... That's my thought about that question.
Did you want to say anything,
Yeah.
Cardinal? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Well, I've also heard, you have to judge if it's true, that Luther was very much influenced by the late German mysticism, Tauler, and those other mystics. And someone said, if history had been different, we might have had a Lutheran order and not a Lutheran church. And we sometimes make a joke in Sweden that the different Protestant denominations could have been different schools of spirituality. Someone compared the Jesuits to the Salvation Army, and now the Lutheran can be compared to the Carmelites. Mm-hmm. So that's another way. It's not only a joke, there is something true in that. And then the other questions, to find the truth, to find the Father. And I think Thérèse of Lisieux has helped many people to realize that the Father is a merciful God, that we needn't be afraid of him. So many people were brought up in fear of God. Sartre, for instance, he was always afraid when he heard that God is looking upon us in every moment. Whereas we look upon it as a mercy without end. God is always following us as a merciful Father. So I think that truth is very important to help people to realize that we have a merciful Father who is always looking upon us with love and care.
Yes, Bishop Karin, you wanted to
Yes,
say
in 2017, we had different ecumenical dialogues on Luther. And then I met a Catholic priest, and he asked me a question. He said, okay, what spiritual problems do people have that I should send to the Lutheran Church? I mean, what problems can you solve? You know? And I said that, I think we are very good at people being afraid of God if we are going to use Luther. So that will probably be our kind of treatment, you know. So he was suggesting that we should say, okay, people have a lot of questions, they need different spiritualities, and sometimes we have to be open that, okay, I might meet a Catholic that needs some kind of Lutheran counseling. So I think that was a kind of spiritual ecumenism.
Thank you. Are there some more questions or comments? Yes, Father. And then we have two over here. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Father Bob Gall from the Bush School of Business here at Catholic University of America. And both of you spoke about an ecumenism of prayer and of holiness. I wondered if you could expand upon that further and maybe address what are the geographic areas that you think might be hot spots for developing this? Thank you.
And another question, just
Thank you. I was curious, would you care to share a particular vignette from Teresa's life that particularly draws you to her or speaks to you of her relationship with God?
okay. So you got those two questions then? Okay. Welcome to.
Would you like? Yeah. Ladies first. So the geographical hotspot and the prayer and holiness movement. I think, well, Sweden could be a hotspot, perhaps. But I can tell you about, I was in Wittenberg in 2017 at the Luther Congress, and I took part in a seminar about Catholic Lutheran dialogues around the world. And it was the same seminar group meeting every day for 4 days, and we had 2 hours a day. And people were presenting what is happening in our country, what are we doing in our dialogues. And then I realized that it was different kinds of dialogues across the world. And if we could get those dialogues in connection with each other, we could do a lot more. And I know that I have read parts of the Declaration on the Way from the US, trying to find what fruits can the different dialogues bring if we put them in dialogue with each other. And I would say that would be very interesting, I think. And I also realized that from Sweden, we were 2 participants from Sweden, we were talking about spirituality. Other countries were discussing dogmatical issues, historical issues, more pastoral issues when families belong to different churches or denominations. So I think that we could bring to the table experiences of reading the same literature and so on.
I think also one of the hotspots is the other countries where Christians are persecuted. And we see that there the cross brings people together of different backgrounds. In Sweden we have received many Christians from the Middle East, and they have given a new dynamical force to our Christians in Sweden, because they know what it is to suffer for the faith, they know what it is to be true to Christ in different circumstances. And many of them have the cross tattooed on their arm, and some of the young men, some of them love tattoos, so one has the Last Supper on his arm. It's a new kind of evangelization. I don't recommend it for everyone, but and we now also have, well, that is an interesting history. In Stockholm we have been able to buy 3 Lutheran churches in areas where there are no Lutherans left, because Stockholm has become a very segregated city, and the Swedes move out, so there are hardly any Lutherans left. There are Muslims, Orthodox and Catholics. So we've been able to buy 3. Thanks for that. We are very grateful, but it's sad that you had to go away. And we call that church the Church of the Holy Martyrs, and it's used by the Syriac Christians. And they have made a painting of all the martyrs they knew from Iraq. Even a little baby, a priest who also worked in Sweden for a certain time. Then he went back to Iraq. He had the threats on his mobile phone. If you come to church and celebrate Mass, we will kill you. But he said, it's more important for me to celebrate Mass. And he was killed. So I think we mustn't forget that that's a very important hotspot for spirituality. That as Christians we have to be martyrs. We have to suffer for our faith, and then we will also come closer to each other. So I think that's very important. And then we have the other question.
Yes. Second question was
a scene from the life of Therese, and I think of this story of hers. She is the little child standing below the staircase, and the little child has to go up. It tries to go up, but it cannot succeed because it's too small and too weak. And of course that could be a frustration, but the child knows that up on the top stands the father or the mother. The merciful God will bring you up on the staircase or on the elevator. I find that a very beautiful image of God's fatherly mercy for us weak and deficient persons. So Teresa can help us in that way.
Yeah.
Have you got another?
Yes, I used to return to something she writes about everyone trying to climb up the mountain, trying to succeed in different ways, and we are all forcing ourselves up the mountain. And then she writes to her sister that let's run down the mountain instead, down to Christ and his love. And I could also say that I was in Lisieux a couple of years ago together with my niece Signe, and we went to the childhood home of Therese, and that was quite an experience, I would say, because then I realized that you know, I read the books and I make images of how it was, and then experience that this is like, oh, she was a person living in a home like everyone else. That is important to see that she wasn't a strange woman. She was a child, and we could see what she was playing with when she was a kid. That was an experience also.
More, let's let some other people have a chance. Yeah, yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. And we have another question over here.
And over there.
And two of them.
Two of them, yes.
Yeah. And sorry, I don't know everyone's name, but I saw your hand up too. So.
Hi. You mentioned Luther's letter on Christian freedom earlier, like serving as some form of spiritual direction. And I was wondering, like, I know spiritual direction comes up in St. Thérèse's Story of a Soul as well, like how spiritual direction as a practice of spirituality compares in Lutheranism versus like the Carmelite tradition.
And a question a little bit back there. Thanks. So spiritual direction is question one, and then there's question two.
When you were mentioning Therese and her childhood home, it connected for me with my own experience of rereading some of her writings recently, and thinking about her youthful innocence, but also the theological depth. I have 4 children. I see it every day. They bring both things at the same time. What did it mean to put her in an intergenerational set of conversations in your book project?
Okay, those are 2 good questions about
yes,
spiritual
very good
direction
question.
And intergenerational. Yeah.
Yes, and intergenerational, like today and yesterday, or when Signe and I went to Lisieux, because that was also intergenerational. And I realized when I was there with a child, she saw other things that I couldn't see. So I was very fascinated about her response and her questions, and what she wanted to do. So she was like directing me in a way. I was telling her about St. Thérèse, and she was understanding her in another way. Then sometimes people ask me, because I move the Carmelites from Martin Luther and the Carmelites from the 16th century into our time, and that is also quite intergenerational. And they wouldn't probably have understood each other if they have met then, But I try to be a good moderator and get them to learn from each other and so on. And in that project, I have to I have to put the emphasis on things that they share. So they won't criticize each other in this book. So that's the strategy, I would say. And then it was the question also about spiritual direction. Perhaps you would like to begin with that.
Well, I'll try to connect the questions. We have the experience in Sweden that there are many grandparents who have the responsibility to transmit the faith to their grandchildren, because the generation in between is not interested. And I think it's very important for every Christian to see that he has a responsibility to transmit the faith to the young generation. Of course, spiritual direction, we mostly think about priests, monks, nuns, and who give that. But I think that every Christian who has really lived united to Christ has something to transmit to others. That we, on a mutual level, have to help each other as brothers and sisters to live the faith. That each baptized person, thanks to the gifts of faith, hope, and charity, has the possibility to influence others. Of course, we need people who are spiritual masters, and we need more of them, who can really help people on the way to holiness. But sometimes we are a bit afraid to give advice, to help people around us to live their faith. And as you said, children can often help their parents. And we also see that children who come to catechism bring their parents to church. It's not always the parents who bring their children. So it is important for every single person to see that through my relationship to Christ, I can do something to help people to come closer to Him. Just telling about my experience of prayer, what Christ means to me. Then, of course, you are right. The church needs to help more of their priests, sisters, and brothers to be able to give spiritual direction. There is a great need of the personal spiritual direction, and it can be difficult to find people who are able to give that. But I think that everyone who belongs to Christ has the possibility to help others to come closer to Him.
Yes, and I was thinking about what Lutheran spiritual direction, what would be the essence of that? And in Luther's writings, there is a description of grace that I am very fond of. And it says that grace is to be taken out of one's own sight. So that you won't be that preoccupied with yourself all the time, thinking that, oh, I'm too little, or they will think that I'm not too smart and so on. But just inspired by Christ, go out and do the good things that He inspires you to do. So that, I would say, is very important as a theme in spiritual direction within the Lutheran tradition, to not be too preoccupied with your own self and your own problems, and instead try to do the best with the resources that you have. And in Therese's writings, I find it very encouraging that she has sometimes a bit of a difficulty to tell her confessor about what's really in her heart. You know, she's a bit shy, and she's a bit afraid of not being understood and so on. And I think that a lot of people are struggling with such problems. So you think that, oh, do I really have the courage? Will this priest or pastor understand what I'm struggling with? And I find it encouraging that Christ actually makes things happen, so she will find someone who understands her. And that's also my hope and my prayer, that people today will meet priests and pastors and Christians and everything that can help them.
I think we have time for about 2 or 3 more questions. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
Thank you for this conversation. It is wonderful. I am intrigued by the flowers. And did you ever discover why she writes so much about flowers?
No, but I realized one thing, that I began to like more flowers after reading her books. So sometimes when I'm walking in Uppsala, or when I'm skiing, in fact, because she also writes about snow, and I am very fond of snow. So sometimes I can be reminded of her writings and her teachings when I get home and I see a very beautiful flower, and I said, oh, and especially if I see a flower and it's snow on it, then I think, oh, this is grace, twice, you know. So you could, but she had a very wonderful garden when she grew up. I realized that. So I took a lot of pictures of the garden and the flowers in the garden and so on.
Any final question? Yes, John.
May I suggest that you continue your receptive dialogue, including a person who in the Carmelites is appreciated an awful lot by Reformation churches.
Thank you, brother.
I understand that there's a window in the National Cathedral to him. This is Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection.
Ah, yes. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We become victims to all the stimuli, but rather we be mindful. This book called, this is the dialogues that is actually took, speaking with the brother. You might find that interesting.
Thank you.
Did everyone hear that? He was observing about Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection.
Yes.
That he might be a good person to include in the dialogue too, because of his ecumenical appeal as a Carmelite. Yeah.
And that's very interesting. His book was translated long before the Carmelites came to Sweden by a member of the free churches, because they recognized this daily life in the presence of God. And that's very important to help people, whatever they do, whatever work they have, that they can live constantly united to God in His presence, that the risen Lord is alive amongst us, that we can always live and adore Him whatever we do. So for many people that's the easiest way to approach Carmelite spirituality, Brother Lawrence. But he's often forgotten, and we have to say that we have mea culpa. We have forgotten to speak about him. So thank you, Father John, for reminding us that he can be a very helpful spiritual director.
I think we've got one more question in the back here, and then any final comments you all want to make. So.
Your Eminence and Your Grace, I very much enjoyed this conversation, and it is very edifying to see the ecumenical relation between you two. And I grew up, and I have a lot of friends that are Lutheran and Protestant and of other religions and denominations. What are some good tips on being more warmer and welcoming to those of other faith traditions, especially within Christianity, on like a practical level? Thank you.
Well, I think it's important that we as Christians speak together about our faith, not only about the weather and things like that. Also in our parishes, we have a Swedish custom, a church coffee after Mass, and sometimes ask people, what do you speak about? Do you speak about the weather, or how much it's cheaper in that shop? Or do you speak about your faith? Sometimes we are too shy to speak about our own experience of God, speak about what God means for us. And I think inside our churches, but also when we meet, it's so important that we have the courage to open up our heart and tell what is God for me, how I've met him, and what does it mean for me to be a Christian. So this sharing of our faith in daily life is very important. And then many of the prejudices will fall away, because we have the same life, we have the same difficulties, and we have the same God who helps us. So I would say this everyday conversation with each other can be very helpful to bring us closer together.
Yes, and I think also about doing things together, especially with young people. To this autumn we are going to Rome to a TC meeting with the brothers. It will be the last of September, and they have encouraged us to travel there from Sweden together, from different church traditions, different denominations, and we will have 36 hours on bus together, you know. And we are planning this trip with different kinds of prayers and games and so on, just to spend time together. And I think that will be an ecumenical experience, that we cannot plan what will happen, but we will have the same problems, the same questions, the same feelings, and we will need to encourage each other. And we have something to talk about when we go home again. What have we experienced in Rome? And that is one tip, doing things together. And when I grew up, I was part of the youth movement in the Church of Sweden, but when I became a teenager, there were no groups for me in the Church of Sweden in my home parish. So I was involved in an ecumenical group. There were no Catholics in Filipstad, but we came from different Christian traditions, and that was very important to me, because then I got to know people praying in different ways. And I wasn't, I was a bit, I thought it was a bit strange sometimes, but I got to know the people, and then you realize that, okay, you can pray in this way too. So when I go to another church or I meet Christians from another denomination, I used to ask myself the question, how do they proclaim Christ in this context? How do they pray in this context? What can I learn from their kind of prayer and their kind of proclamation? And how do they witness about their faith? And that I find very inspiring. So having young people meeting each other, I would recommend.
I think people are probably eager to get to the reception after and get a few refreshments, but we want to thank very much Cardinal Arborelius and Bishop Karin Johannesson for this wonderful exchange this afternoon. So can we give them a... And on behalf of Brother Darrell and myself from the Center for Carmelite Studies, we want to thank them and to thank Dr. Peter Kilpatrick, for the president of Catholic University, for his remarks at the beginning. It's very nice that we have a CUA president who loves Thérèse. And the members of the Catholic Lutheran Dialogue who are here, Bishop Marianne Bude, who's here, and all of those from the John Paul II Shrine, the staff here who've helped us so much, and Carlos for the audio visuals, and all the members of the Carmelite family who are here watching, or those watching on YouTube, and all of you here or online who've joined us this afternoon. You heard at the beginning that this is an anniversary year for St. Thérèse, the 100th anniversary of her beatification, 150th of her birth, and 200th of her father's birth. And we are going to have more Thérèse celebrations this fall. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list to get announcements for that, when you go out to the reception, you'll see there's a table there with some forms where you can take to if you'd like to buy the book that we've been discussing, or other books, Carmelite books. But also, if you'd like to receive the newsletter, you can sign up there, and we'll put you on our mailing list. And is there anything else we need to say?
Just to encourage everyone to come down to the reception.
Yes.
Very delicious food.
Yeah.
What a nice way to conclude our gathering around food.
No. So did either of you have any final words? Or I didn't want to cut you off, but I think people are getting hungry, so I thought we better. So thank you all very much for coming this afternoon, and we're very grateful. Yeah.